Well, thank you all very much for that warm welcome. I want to begin by, let's take about 5 or 10 seconds, say 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of the Parkland, Florida shooting, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. So if you can indulge me here, let's just take about 10 seconds in memory of them as we start our conversation. Thank you. David, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
You're a pretty good storyteller. At one time, you aspired to be a journalist. So let's begin by telling the audience, why are you here? You've flown from the Badlands of Connecticut here. Why are you here? What's your message? What's your theme?
Good question. So the reason why I'm here today is because I initially, let me just go back to the day of the shooting and why I went out and started speaking on TV, because I think that's that's something that a lot of people don't understand. So after everything happened at my school, and after seeing so many students run out for their lives, not knowing whether or not they're going to make it out alive, and interviewing students in my classroom at the time, not knowing whether or not we were going to make it out alive, because at the time we didn't know where the shooting was occurring when I was in the classroom with about 60 other students and I interviewed them, so that Congress would have to pay attention to what their inaction was causing, which was death, and the destruction of our future as a generation. But after I made it out of school and I was finally home, my sister had come home that day and she was 14 years old and she'd lost 4 friends. And she found out through like Snapchat and Instagram and other social media platforms from her friends texting her. And really, for the first time in my life, as essentially a 17-year-old walking hormone, I had felt empathy. I had felt uncomfortable by the cries that my sister had. I had felt like there was something. It was a feeling that I'd never had before, and I didn't know what to do at that time. But what I did know is that I didn't want this just to be another mass shooting in terms of how it was covered, where it's typically, at maximum, a 2-week story where the news media comes into town, films it, moves on, and then comes back a year later to film it, with nothing happening as a result. So with the uncomfortability of what my sister was going through and not realizing it was really just empathy at that time, I went out there and spoke. For the people that couldn't at the time, because I knew that even though I wasn't in the building where the shooting occurred, I wanted to make sure that the individuals that were had a platform to go out and speak after the shooting, had a platform to go out where this wasn't just another 2-week story, so that they would be able to say what they saw that day if they were comfortable enough to do so, and so that individuals like my sister who had lost 4 friends and were crying so much they could barely speak to their own parents at the time, would be able to go out there when they were able to wipe away their tears enough to start talking to the media and start talking and telling their story about how gun violence is an issue that shouldn't occur in any other country. So I went out there and spoke to as many people as I could using my speech and debate and TV production skills to make sure that we were able to create some kind of change. And coincidentally, my first interview that I ever did live on TV was on Laura Ingram's show. And I ended that interview by essentially saying, hold on, I don't want this just to be another mass shooting. I don't want this just to be another school shooting. This has to be one of the last. So similar to the namesake of my high school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas herself, I didn't start out as an activist. I started out as a journalist wanting to tell other people's story that couldn't at the time, but ended up becoming, when I ended up realizing that I couldn't just stand by the sidelines and I couldn't just cover the story as just something that had happened, but I had to say something myself. That's when I started metamorphosizing into an activist and a gun violence prevention advocate, so that instances that happen like what happened at my school, never have to happen again. And by the way, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas herself was a gun violence prevention advocate. She was at the signing of the Brady Bill, and I think it was in 1994. She was an environmentalist, a women's suffragette, and a civil rights activist. So we have a lot to live up to as students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. But I think we're doing pretty good so far.
And you've been working now for a year at this. As objectively as you can, what do you think you have accomplished?
I'm trying to be as objective as possible. I think what we've accomplished is a little in an area, we've accomplished a little in an area where even anything is a lot, right? Because people are always like, oh, nothing can happen around gun violence in the United States. We can't talk about disarming domestic abusers, for example. Because we know, like, for example, we know that one of the number one predictors, as I was telling you earlier, of a mass shooter, one of the number one predictors of somebody being a mass shooter is a history of domestic violence, right? And one of the laws that we advocate for and that we got passed in Florida less than a month after the shooting at my high school was extreme risk protection orders that could have disarmed the shooter at my high school so that they never would have been able to have a gun in the first place. Because even though the FBI and police were called on them 38 times, or over 38 times, they weren't able to take their guns away because there was no law around that through due process, mind you. So what do I think we've accomplished? I think we've accomplished a little in an area where nothing is expected, so that means a lot. Because since the shooting at our school, we've seen over 70 new gun laws be created in over 26 states that look like waiting periods, that look like universal background checks, that look like extreme risk protection orders that disarm domestic abusers and people that are a risk to themselves and others through due process. And the thing that I'm most proud of is two things. One, the stories that we don't hear about, the mass shootings that we didn't learn about, and the instances of gun violence that we don't hear about because they were stopped because of the laws that we've created. One of those instances, yeah. One of those instances was an instance at the University of Central Florida where there was a plotted mass shooting like a couple months after the shooting at our school where there was a young man that was planning to kill several hundred people using assault-style weapons like your AR-15 and what have you, that was stockpiling ammunition and guns and making threats. And because of the law that we created, he was able to have his guns taken away through due process, where a judge said, no, you were literally threatening to go and shoot up one of the largest universities in the United States, and they're able to disarm them through due process and the court of law. And that's one thing I'm incredibly proud of. And the other thing that I'm incredibly proud of is the rise in youth voter turnout across the country. So over the summer, we went on a bus tour across the country with the goal of disarming the NRA's political power. We went to districts, we went to over 26 states over the summer, to districts where we knew if we could get a couple more students that had walked out to vote, had walked out of their schools on March 14th, if we could get those students to turn out in an area with historically low youth voter turnout and a low voter differential, that we could disarm the NRA's political power and take them out of power. And we did that. And we did the same thing in Florida, where we went to a group of my friends from Douglas and other students from Douglas that weren't initially part of the group because they couldn't be because they were too emotional, understandably so, joined our tour and went through Florida to every congressional district and registered thousands of new voters, went out there and told young people that we don't have to live in this current state where there's a war in our schools and on our streets, where gun violence is accepted constantly, because for our generation, we're not going to accept that. So when we did that, and we went out there and told the young people that this is something that we can't allow to continue because it is literally killing our generation. In Florida alone, we saw youth voter turnout increase from 2014 from 22% to 37%, which is a nearly doubling of youth voter turnout. And on top of that, we took more NRA-backed politicians out of power than ever before in American history. And lastly, we focused on youth voter turnout because we realized that it's not either political party that is really going to be able to solve this issue, because Democrats saw this as a third rail previous to the shooting at our school, to be honest. And Republicans saw it as a third rail as well, but now they see this as the only rail that they have to talk about. And the reason why we focus on youth voter turnout and voter turnout overall is because it actually relates back to Dr. Martin Luther King's principles of nonviolence, the 6 principles. And one of those principles is attacking the sources of evil and not the people perpetrating it. Because for me, for example, what I'm not interested in is how do we get the current president out of power? How do we stop that president from being created in the first place? How do we stop the white nationalism that is creating him? How do we stop the broken education system that creates him and the lack of education that allowed him to be in power in the first place, right? So by attacking those sources of evil and making sure youth are properly represented, we realize that politicians, no matter what the political party is that's in power, are going to have to care about the fact that gun violence is the second leading cause of death for children in the United States, right? So no matter which political party they're from, if youth are voting them in, they're going to have to care about the youth issues. So, yeah.
But David, we were early, but we were already in a new presidential campaign, 2020. And the Democratic field has not filled out yet. But I don't hear any of the Democratic candidates who have announced thus far talking much, if any, about gun control.
Yeah, I think I think that's true to an extent, but I think what we keep hearing is people that are all talk and no plan, right? We keep hearing people say, like, for example, like, I support common sense gun laws. I support universal. That's not enough. You should have supported universal background checks after the Charleston shooting. You should have supported closing the Charleston loophole right after that shooting. What we need is a plan. What we need is presidential candidates that are out there right now. And if they're listening or they watch this, they need to understand this message. Saying that you support common sense gun laws is not enough. Where is your plan to reduce gun violence by 90% over the next 10 years in the United States of America? Because it is possible.
And David, to that candidate who says to you, look, I'm with you, David, I like it, but if I start talking about the things that you, David, want me to talk about, this is our hypothetical candidate, I don't have a chance in the primary. That not just the NRA, but gun supporters in general will knock me out so fast that I can't stand long. To that you say what?
I say that the NRA supporters in the 3%, for example, that don't support universal background checks make up a political minority in the United States. And if everybody in this room and everybody that you know turned out to vote against those people, it doesn't matter where they stand on guns, because we realize that what we're talking about is not how do we take away everybody's guns, it's how do we stop kids from dying inside and outside of our schools in every zip code. Because that's what we need our presidential candidates to be talking about, right? And the second that we become silent about the things that matter is the second that we start dying. It's the second that there's another school shooting. It's the second that another kid is shot as a result of an act of everyday gun violence in a zip code that Congress completely neglects and doesn't talk about, right? So I think, honestly, if we have political leaders that fear their political future because they're talking about whether or not kids should be dying in the United States, they shouldn't have a political future. And on top of that, we need presidential candidates that aren't only talking about new gun laws, but we need a top-down and a bottom-up approach to this issue. We need to be talking about, for example, what new laws we can create and how we can fund research at the CDC, the NIH, the NIJ, and the National Science Foundation. But also we need to be talking about the fact that why in America do young men, especially young men, feel the need to arm themselves in the first place, right? The questions that we need to be asking is, why do young men in America believe oftentimes that it's not okay to feel any other emotion than angry, and that it's not okay to act any other way than violent, right? The questions that we should be asking is, why do young men in America, I know especially growing up and going to high school, like in Florida, why do young men continuously believe, for example, that feminism doesn't mean equality, right? Because that's a major issue that we need to be talking about. And we need the presidential candidates to be talking about individuals that aren't on this stage right now, like Erica Ford. Erica Ford's an amazing woman that's been working for the past 2 decades in Jamaica, Queens, and New York at gun violence reduction and gun violence prevention, not by creating new gun laws, but actually interrupting shootings right before they happen and creating like mentorship for a lot of the students and young people that live in that area, where they were able to take one neighborhood that they started out in from 17 murders pretty much annually since before 2001. There were about 17 in that area every year. And in the past 18 years since they started in 2001, they've had 1 murder, right? Those are the stories that aren't told. And we need to fund violence intervention programs that are part of restorative justice that help mentor youth and help foster a better relationship with them. Because even though if it's an individual that's not using a gun to shoot someone else, if they're still using a knife to knife someone, we still have a problem there, right? We need to be addressing violence and making sure that as a society, in a similar way to how Angela Davis said in a racist society, it's not simply enough to be like non-racist, we all must be anti-racist. I would argue in a violent society, it's simply not enough just to be non-violent, we all must be anti-violence. So.
But David, what's on your wish list? Take me through the top 5 things that you want to see accomplished in this area and that you believe it's realistic to work toward.
Yeah, first thing is actually funding research at the CDC. Funding research at the CDC, the National Institutes of Justice, the National Institute of Health, and the National Science Foundation. Because right now, do you guys know how many gun violence researchers there are in the United States that study gun violence full time? I didn't know this before the shooting. There's 8. They're in a group chat, seriously. And there are 40,000 people dying annually as a result of, gun deaths in the United States, a majority of which are suicides, and a majority of which are actually my demographic in terms of suicide, because a majority of people that commit suicide it's disproportionately like young, typically white men in rural and suburban areas that kill themselves with guns, because guns are used in over 50% of suicides. They're the most popular method. But we can't even study the effectiveness of what child access prevention laws are in these states, right? So funding research at the CDC and government institutions is a major part. I'd like to see $100 million annually allocated towards gun violence prevention research to see which laws actually work and which ones don't. On top of that, I want to see guns put under the Consumer Protection Act, because right now guns produced domestically in the United States, because of a law that the NRA pushed for, and why, as more evidence to why they don't support gun owners and they only support gun manufacturers. In the United States, toy guns are more regulated for safety than actual guns, right? So it's legally allowed for guns to be sold in the United States because of a law that the NRA pushed for and got passed to support the gun manufacturers that are funding them to sell a gun that just randomly goes off if you shake it a certain way, even if you don't pull the trigger. Where there have been instances, Dan, where a young man was out hunting with his brother or his friend, right, and he shook the gun in a certain way, and it went off and killed the person that he was with, right? And that person was charged with murder, and it was later revealed that the gun inadvertently went off, and this was a major problem with the rifle that I'm talking about, which was a Remington rifle that had a major flaw. But what's crazy is, like, I used to think to myself, like, well, that's weird. Why don't they just sue the gun manufacturers, right? Like, why aren't these gun manufacturers held accountable? Because I'm sure the NRA supports holding gun manufacturers that sell incredibly dangerous weapons for gun owners that can randomly go off. I'm sure the NRA, as an organization that supports gun owners, as they always say, supports holding irresponsible gun manufacturers accountable. But you know what? It's against federal law to sue gun manufacturers because of the law that they pushed for, because they don't represent gun manufacturers. Or they don't represent gun owners, they represent manufacturers. And we know that because most of their funding comes from commissions of gun sales, advertisements within their magazines that gun manufacturers pay for, and on top of that, multi-million-dollar memberships that predominantly the C-suite of gun manufacturers has, where it's the CMO or the CEO that has a gold or platinum membership with the NRA. It's millions of dollars every year. And yeah, I think asking to fund gun violence research, put guns under the Consumer Protection Act, and actually being allowed to sue gun manufacturers for selling faulty weapons is not unrealistic to look for. And on top of that, creating a gun licensing system isn't unrealistic either, because the fact that in most states you need a license to go fishing, but not to buy a gun is kind of absurd and ridiculous, right? So that's what I look for. It's not to take away your guns. It's to stop kids from getting killed. Because when I see people post photos in response to me like, hey, check out my awesome like T5000 gun that's like can shoot like a mile away. It's like, yeah, cool gun. But you know what's cooler? Kids' dreams.
David, it's no secret at all that Texas has a long history of being a gun culture. And most of the people you talk to in the state, I may be wrong over this, but I don't think so, on one way or the other, whether they will say so or not, they have some reluctance when they hear you speak with passion, as you just have, about what's needed. I want to ask you, if someone listening to you here today is saying to themselves, either in the audience or they see it on television, how here's this left-wing bomb-throwing Bolshevik Dan Rather once again talking to this liberal young, I won't use the word punk or something. No, but this is the way to talk. Who's here to take our guns? And what I'm asking you is to talk in a way, if you think there is a way, where you can reach some common ground with the attitude of, sir, madam, you and I may disagree about 100 things, but can we agree on these things? Talk to me about where, if anywhere, you think there may be common ground to be found.
So it's interesting that you're bringing that up because my first interaction in Texas after the shooting was going to a place that loves us dearly, Dallas, Texas, where we had a town hall and we had counter-protesters out front, in front of us. And you know, if anybody's here that doesn't agree with me, first of all, thank you for being here and even listening to us, because I know that can be one of the hardest things to do, is actually going and listening to people just to hear what they say that you don't agree with, because I know even in my position, I wouldn't want to do that if I was in your position. But thank you for being here. So one time, I'll just tell you this short story. When we're at this event and there's people outside of our event yelling like racial slurs at people coming into our event, because the school that we were doing it, that we had this event outside of was an HBCU, I believe. They were yelling racial slurs at people coming into our event. They were yelling like, "Where's that Hogg boy?" And like because of Texas, as I'm sure you guys know, is an open carry state. Most of them are armed with your typical assault rifle, AR-15, MP-15, AR-10, what have you. And we're outside of our event, so my friend and I went and did what any sane person would do and went and spoke to them. And as we were out there, the first question that this guy that comes over to me asks is like, "Why do you want to take our guns away?" And I ask him 3 questions. I say, you know, "Are you a domestic abuser?" "No." "Okay. Are you trying to kill yourself?" "No." "Okay. Lastly, are you a terrorist?" "No, absolutely not." "I'm not trying to take your guns away. And if I was, it'd be through due process in the court of law, where you'd have 72 hours to go and argue that you are not a risk to yourself and others, and that you can't have those guns in the first place, right? Through due process, through an extreme risk protection order." And the guy's like, "You know what? I kind of agree with you," right? And then I'm like, "Well, do you know how much money is allocated to just studying gun violence and studying how to protect gun owners in the United States from the CDC to see the effectiveness of laws that are around gun violence prevention?" And he's like, "Oh, it's got to be like hundreds of millions of dollars a year." And I'm like, "Actually, it's 0. Because the NRA fought for a law that made it illegal, a crime, to study gun violence and gun laws at the CDC. Really? Yeah." So I was like, do you think we need to study gun violence research to figure out like the effectiveness of some of the laws that you believe in, like concealed carry reciprocity at a federal level, compared to the laws that I believe in, like disarming domestic abusers? So he's like, "Yeah, I'd support that." And then after that, I was like, we just continued this discussion for like an hour and a half. And by the end of it, they ended up crying and hugging us, right? From a group of people, don't clap yet though. Because it turned out that this guy was an actual white supremacist that we didn't realize at the time. That was part of the Proud Boys. But the fact that we were able to go out and talk to absolutely insane individuals like that and have a discussion with them is testament that there's a lot more that this country thinks that there's a lot more that this country actually agrees on than they think they don't, right? Because there's a reason why March for Our Lives doesn't endorse Democrats or Republicans or any candidates, and it's because we know it's not one candidate or one party that's going to be able to solve this issue. It has to be both parties working together to solve this issue. The realization that, first of all, gun violence is a problem in the United States, and it's not just in our schools, right? And realizing that what's not going to make our, like, one talking point the NRA comes up with a lot after school shootings is like, we need to make our schools safer, right? by the way, every one of their solutions just revolves around selling more guns. And that's another way that you can tell that they're actually funded by gun manufacturers, right? Because if they always go out there and say the only thing that makes you safe from a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, guess what? They're trying to sell you 2 guns, right? And then they come up with this argument about hardening schools, which hardening, by the way, is really just a euphemism for militarizing our schools and incarcerating especially black and brown youth even more, right? Let's go through this mindset of what a hardened school looks like that the NRA always brings up, okay? So a single point of entry with a metal detector, right? Right? Single point of entry with a metal detector, small windows that are bulletproof so the shooter can't shoot through them and that it's harder to see through. And doors that lock automatically from a remote area so that you can close in the shooter. And bulletproof walls and doors and barbed wire around the school to make sure that a shooter can't hop over the fence. But you know what I just described to you? Prison, right? What's not going to make our children safer is arming teachers. What's not going to make them safer What's not going to make our children safer is over-incarcerating them and throwing them in prison for their own trauma again and again. Because if over-incarceration and mass incarceration solved any of our problems, I would not be talking to you right now, right? What's not going to solve this problem is continuously over-policing our youth and throwing them into prison again and again, right? Because that's not what actual rehabilitation looks like, because we have a broken prison system in the United States that needs serious reform. And on top of that, what will help our students, for anybody that's been in high school recently, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say this, we need actual guidance counselors that are properly funded, that aren't just paid schedulers, right? What school safety actually looks like is community-based violence intervention and mentorship within our schools, so that kids that come from families that may not have the best family life are able to have a mentor at school and somebody that cares about them that did go down that same path in the past, for example, that may have gone and had a history of violent crime in the past, but has reformed themselves and wants to work with their community to help reform those students. Because when I think about community-based violence intervention programs, I think of Life Camp. I think of the fact that they're in schools in New York City, interrupting fights and mentoring students as young people to young people, and not police to young people that don't care about them in the first place.
Let me move the conversation to the area of journalism. You've done a lot of thinking about this. Put in perspective for us what your questions are for the press, for working reporters like myself, when it comes to coverage of mass shootings such as the one that happened in Parkland.
Honestly, my questions don't really revolve to those reporters, because those reporters are a result of the people that are consuming their media, right? And they're a reflection of what their consumers want to raise their ratings at the end of the day, predominantly, because that's what drives storytelling in our current journalism system. My question to viewers, though, would be why are we okay with continuous glamorization of mass shooters, right? Why are we okay with the fact that when I see students walk out of high schools on the north side of Chicago that I've talked to, where they're like, yeah, our school district fully supported this and endorsed the walkout on March 14th. And we had reporters on the ground where they were asking us questions like, why are you protesting gun violence? Why are you standing up against it? But then my friends like Alex King on the west side of Chicago, who's been working in gun violence prevention for the past 2 decades to help treat trauma in students using the Kingian principles of nonviolence in the Chicago Unified School District, when he walks out of his school, he gets threatened with suspension and expulsion and arrest outside of his school with the police there. And the way he gets covered isn't with reporters on the ground. It's by a news helicopter that makes it look like a violent protest when they're protesting against the same gun violence that's been occurring in their community for centuries, right? That's my question, is why are we okay with that, and why don't we acknowledge it? Why aren't we talking about it, right? Because the media is a reflection of our own beliefs. What the media shows constantly is a reflection of what we want to see. Where if it's a white mass shooter, it's always, oh, they were mentally ill, right? And we only continue to stigmatize mental health in a society where a vast majority of the time, statistically speaking, violently ill individuals are way more likely to be the victims of gun violence, not the perpetrators, right? Why are we okay with the constant profiling of young people that live in predominantly communities of color oftentimes that are plagued by gun violence, but they get covered completely differently, right? Where when there's a shooting at my high school, the people that get talked about get their life story told. So, for example, one of those individuals is Joaquin Oliver, who came here with his family from Venezuela fleeing violence to Parkland, Florida, because it was the safest community in Florida and had one of the best public schools, and was shot and killed there, and his story gets told that way, right? With justice, as every story around gun violence should. But the way that somebody's story like Zaire Kelly gets told, Zaire was a young man walking home from a college prep class in Washington, D.C., who was a twin, and his brother's name is Zion, and he spoke at the march. But the way that his story gets covered, when he was walking home from college prep class and got mugged and then shot and killed, the way that his story gets covered is as gang violence because of the zip code he lives in and the color of his skin, right? Where it gets treated as an issue that can't be solved. Where we treat gun violence, and like the mass media treats gun violence in communities of color predominantly as an everyday problem that never can be solved, only fueling the hopelessness that has been happening in communities affected by gun violence of every color for centuries, right? Why do we allow that to happen? But to answer your question, my question to journalists is, how do you stay objective, Dan? How do you stay objective, like, where do you draw the line between where you have to call, as my friend said, BS, and being a journalist, right? Where like you'll see, like, for example, in the days of Nixon and the Vietnam War, to take it back some, like the fact that like, as you said earlier, he went out there as like the guy that was going to end the war, and then all of a sudden just became, to be quite frank, the bitch of the military-industrial complex, right? That's still here to this day and is a major problem that we need to address. But how do you stay objective in that situation as a journalist?
Well, I think it begins with the answer that no journalist can be totally objective, totally unbiased, every day, in every way, on every story. That the test of a journalist of integrity is over a reasonable length of time, how hard does he or she try to keep their own biases out, and how do they succeed? The critical point comes, and you've touched on it, when, as a journalist, you see something happening, you say to yourself, you know what, I'm a journalist, but I'm an American, I'm a citizen, I'm a father, I'm a brother, and this is outrageous. This is not compatible with my conscience. That's the test point of you're trying to stay objective and try to stay unbiased. But, you know, as a lifetime journalist, I can say, I can only speak for myself, you do the best you can, realizing you're going to make your mistakes. But sort of prizing those moments when you have said to yourself, you know, I've got to quit saying that I'm going to deal in false equivalency. It's one of the great dangers of journalism, false equivalency. Well, there's just as many voices on this side as there are on this side.
Yeah.
Not a very good answer, I'm afraid, but most journalists don't have a very good answer to it. But I come back to, you do the best you can, and you hope at the end of a coverage of a story, coverage of a job, a certain job, or end of a career, that you can say you've done the best you've done. We don't have a lot. We are going to take questions here coming up fairly soon. But David, I'm interested in knowing your story. You're a good storyteller. The story of, as you proceeded through this, there's so many things. Number one, how dangerous has it been? You've had threats on your life. Talk about that. How has that affected you?
It's affected me some, but the thing that I think about a lot is when I see death threats, or I get like letters in the mail that like describe me as a jihadist and like show people cutting off my head. I don't think about myself, because I realize literally the stupidest thing anybody that hates me could do to kill this movement is kill me. Literally, like that is literally like throwing gasoline on a fire. Like you really, anyhow. So what I think a lot about is like the people around me. I think about like my good friends that I have, and I think about my sister and how they're going to be supported if I'm not here, right? Because that's a part of movement building, is acknowledging that you you may have a very, very short and finite life, right? Because of the work that you do, because of like people being very against what you're saying, right? But what I encourage people to do, what I think a lot about is like, that's why it's important what I say here today is like as clear and direct as possible so that my voice can continue to carry on. God forbid should something happen, right? God forbid should the very violence that I'm trying to advocate against take my life, that my voice can carry on and like still help lead. Because I think oftentimes like, you know, young kids from like people in civil rights groups right now that are protesting against police brutality, like Black Lives Matter and Good Kids Mad City out of Chicago and other groups, still look to the Kingian principles of nonviolence as their guiding pathway. They still look to his, like Dr. King's principles of nonviolence on how to combat racism and police brutality in the United States, right? Because like on the topic of like being impartial within the media, the thing that like really drives me up the wall and like, I just had to say this because like I just remembered it is like the both sides mentality that we have when it comes to talking about police brutality, right? Because the argument is always it's a few bad apples, and that's not the full saying. It's a few bad apples spoils the bunch, right? Because you know what else was a both sides mentality when that story was told and the way that it was covered by journalists was the story of Emmett Till, right? Where it was like, well, he whistled at this woman. And then all of a sudden, they literally tied him to an industrial fan, beat the shit out of him, threw him in a river, and his mom had to have an open casket for him to show the country what the physical effects of racism were, right? And then after that woman wrote a book about it and made millions of dollars off of it, on her deathbed admits it was all a fabricated lie, right? Because that is not what impartial journalism looks like to me. What impartial journalism doesn't look like to me is when there are actual racial riots in Charlottesville, calling them far right. No, they're fucking Nazis, right? We need to call them that when we see that. But on the topic of how I deal with the threats, I realized that honestly, if I wasn't being effective, people wouldn't be threatening to kill me. Like, that's the plain truth. I live rent-free in millions of people's heads who hate me every day, and I take pleasure in that. Not gonna lie. And honestly, it's just about realizing, like, we're not Democratic pawns. Like, if we were, we would be endorsing Democrats. If we were like true leftist liberals, we wouldn't still be talking about guns. We'd be talking about like their entire policy platform, but we're not. We just want kids to stop dying. Like, that's literally my goal. If putting a gun vending machine on every single street corner, like some people have told us that we should do, actually worked at reducing gun violence, believe me, I would be all for it. If arming every teacher in the United States actually worked to reduce gun violence, I would be all for it. But you know what doesn't resolve gun violence is more guns. Because if more guns made us safer, I would not be on this stage right now in a country with more guns than people.
David, we have only a short while here before we're going to go to audience questions. But I want to ask you about the movement, March for Our Lives. The movement's still alive, in no small measure because of your own efforts. Not exclusively your efforts, it's a broad-ranged effort. Who finances, how do you finance the ongoing March for Our Lives?
Well, I'm glad you asked that so I can do some organizational promotion here. We are financed by primarily small dollar contributions from people like you guys that donate to marchforourlives.com. Because I think our average donation amount is $9, predominantly just from people on the internet that like subscribe to like the March for Our Lives movement, kind of like a Netflix subscription, but to stop kids from dying. Like monthly to like chip in like $5 for gun violence prevention or whatever people can, because there's so many people that believe in the movement. And you're right, it's not just me. You know, the people that I think about when I think about this movement are people like a young woman named Faith in Palm Springs, California, you know, who helped lead, who's the student body president at her high school and helped lead the walkout at her high school and then led a march of thousands of people within her own city, proving that she is a youth, that there is no age limit to changing the world, right? The people that I think about when I think about the March for Lives movement are people like Edna Chavez, right? Who grew up in South Central in Los Angeles, predominantly in an undocumented family, and literally has lost her brother to gun violence in a drive-by shooting where like she was right next to him, right? The people I think about are people like Lucy Macbeth, who lost her son Jordan Davis because he was playing music too loud and somebody literally just shot and killed him because they thought that they saw a gun even though he never had a gun in the first place, right? Who ran for Congress. She ran for Congress after seeing the March for Our Lives movement and got elected in one of the most competitive districts in Georgia that the NRA historically has always held, but she got into that position and just helped introduce universal background checks into Congress. So when I think about this movement, I think about not just the young people, because this movement is not solely led by young people, contrary to popular belief. It's led with young people, right? So for example, like raise your hand if you think that my generation is going to save America. You're wrong. It can't, because we can't do it alone. We need these generations that are currently alive in America to save America. We need every generation going out and voting against gun violence in the United States. We need every generation not just voting for Democrats or Republicans, but voting for morally just leaders that represent us, the people, and not corporations and billionaires. That represent the children and care about whether or not a kid makes it home from whether or not they die from bullets inside of their school or outside. I care about mental health in every community, not just white communities, right? Because when I think about mental health and gun violence, what most people think about is the mental health of shooters. But what I think about is the young woman that I met in East Oakland on our bus tour who lost 20 friends to gun violence in the past 5 years. And nobody knows what her name is because of the zip code she lives in and the color of her skin. Right? Because it's a community where Congress has just accepted gun violence is something that happens on a daily basis. When we're talking about mental health, the people that I think about are the young children, the millions of children that have to go and step over blood-stained sidewalks on their way to school that can get completely neglected, not only by law enforcement, but by their local municipalities, their mayors, their governors, their congressmen, and everyone that's ever been elected to represent them because they've been allowed to say, oh, they don't matter because of the zip code that they live in. But what I'm here to say is that it is time for that to change because we need people from every zip code, from every socioeconomic level, of every age, standing up against gun violence and every form of violence in the United States so we can be the last generation to be a violent generation.
David, time for us to take questions from the audience. I may need your help in reading some of these questions. My eyesight not being quite what it has been, but question from the audience. How does your movement align with the interests of urban youth of color who are often left out of this conversation?
So great question to Beth who asked that. So the way that we try managing that is realizing that March for Our Lives, being from Parkland, Florida, does not know what other communities go through. We don't know what Austin faces when it comes to gun violence. We don't know what gun violence goes on in Jamaica, Queens, and New York City, right? But we do know what it's like to build an allyship between different organizations, and that's where we try focusing, is not speaking for other individuals, but by raising their voices in their platforms like Edna Chavez, and bringing them with us to so many spaces that we're invited to, but they never even dreamt of being invited to in the first place, right? To let them have that platform to speak. So for example, when a bunch of people from March for Our Lives got invited to come and speak at Oxford, we ended up taking 3 people. It was me, Alex King, who works in gun violence prevention and had worked in gun violence prevention from the west side of Chicago for literally over a decade, and he's 18 years old, and Edna Chavez, who's from South Central and has worked in gun violence prevention in her community for years in a space where they never thought that they would be, right? And giving them that platform and sharing the spotlight that we have is really how we try managing that, because we realize that we can't speak for other individuals. I can't speak for the violence that you faced in your community. Only you can do that, and that's why we raise other people's voices. And that's how we try managing that as much as possible.
Question from the audience. How do you feel about active shooter drills? Is it saving lives or traumatizing our youth?
I honestly think that they are terrible. I don't support them at all. Because what scares me about active shooter drills is the fact that we're starting to treat this as acts of God. They're not. These are preventable acts of men and women with guns that shouldn't have had them in the first place, right? We're becoming accustomed to this. This question reminds me of during the Cold War, do you believe in like bombing raid drills where like you have to duck and cover under your desk even though that's never going to protect you from a nuclear weapon, right? No, I want to stop those nukes from being there in the first place through nuclear arms treaties and diplomacy. I want the proper laws in place that stop active shooters from getting on campus, because if we are only trying to stop shooters once they get on campus, we are failing our children and we are killing our generation. So I don't support it because it's so traumatizing to our youth. And it makes it seem like this is only a problem within our high schools and within our schools, and it's not, because most gun violence occurs outside of our schools.
David, another question from the audience. As a high school teacher, what, in your opinion, is the best way to support students who are scared to come to school because of the fear of violence?
Probably fostering a better relationship with them in the first place. Honestly, I think one of the best solutions to school safety is community observance and reducing class size, if we really want to talk about it that way, because the people that know best what's going on with their students are not police officers or even principals. They're going to be the teachers within those classrooms in the first place. So I think the best way of supporting students that are afraid to come to school because of a result of gun violence is by acknowledging that it's something that shouldn't happen, honestly, because there should be no child asked to fear gun violence either on their way to school or inside of school. So what I would do is try to encourage them to see it as an act of courage to come to school in the first place. It's an act of courage to be in an American school on a daily basis, or even to walk in your own community on a daily basis when thousands of people are being killed every year as a result of gun violence. But to be honest, I don't know what the answer is to your question, because it shouldn't be something that happens in the first place.
Well, there's some value in when you don't know the answer to the question to say, I don't know. I fear that journalists don't do that often enough. This question says, to Dan. I want to point out we want to keep our focus on David here. But nonetheless, the question is, why don't journalists and TV affiliates simply refuse to give airtime to mass shooters or corrupt politicians?
I think we know the corrupt politician we're talking about.
Well, we can spend the rest of the afternoon talking about this. Rest easy, we will not. But I would say, two parts to this. The giving airtime to mass shooters is something that journalists, for the length and breadth of my career, long before we got into this most recent run of school shootings, as far back as the 60s and 70s, for example, the Kennedy assassination, how much attention to give Lee Harvey Oswald. This is an ongoing conversation with journalists for which we haven't come up with an answer. There is something to be said, I do think, for individual journalists' conscience. Just rather than just wait for the station manager or the network head to say, we have a new policy about mass shooters. We're going to show the picture of the shooter once and only once. We're going to mention his name only 3 times, and that's going to be it. These kinds of ethical standards put into print or trying to standardize the approach in the past haven't worked very well. So there's something said for an individual journalist to say, you know, on my program or on my beat, with a mass shooter, I'll mention his name once and then move on. Or on my program, I'm not going to show his picture. Now, you may catch hell from the news director or the station manager or the network owner, but that kind of individual responsibility is probably the best we can hope for. And that when one does it, another may notice kind of quietly, you know, David is not putting on his program a shooter. I don't want to raise any false expectations, because the competitive drive, yes, for ratings and audience and subscription, usually carries the day in news. Now, as for giving airtime to mass shooters, I do feel strongly about this. This is something that needs to be addressed quite quickly. That I take a back seat to no man or woman in wanting to break stories. You know, part of my job is to be a story hunter, be a story breaker, as well as a storyteller. But there is a time, again, when conscience has to dictate. And giving airtime, unless it's part of a concentrated effort by those, for say, in a hostage situation, or the mass shooter is holed up somewhere and someone in law enforcement said, listen, we need to keep him talking. That's a different situation. I'm afraid I haven't answered your question all too well, but there are some questions of professional ethics and standards and your own conscience, which you just have to keep reviewing in your own head from time to time. Now back to questions for David. David, you perhaps had a spark for civilian activism within you. You had a spark for activism before the shooting. How did your education prepare you for this, what you've gotten into? How can we as educators foster activism of the kind that you now practice?
How did my education prepare me for this? Speech and debate and TV production, honestly. Arts programs are a huge component of this, Dan, I think. And the reason why I say that is because so many kids that work with us are either from TV production. A vast majority that were in the initial group that we started on the living room floor were from TV production or theater. And that was about probably 95%, if not 100% of the students that were on that living room floor, because we knew how to articulate ourselves. We knew how to speak properly. On the topic of how my education prepared me for this, I'll go down, I'll share with you guys a short story about how I found out about the NRA in the first place. So my father is a gun owner, and almost everybody within my family has a background in law enforcement and are mostly veterans and are current gun owners even to this day. So one month we had a speech and debate topic come up about universal background checks, where we had to argue both sides of the argument. Because in speech and debate, at least in my class, you weren't allowed to pick a side. You had to argue both sides to know both equally. So one thing I always tried doing with this research was I would try finding government research for my debate cases, right? So I tried going on the CDC and looking up CDC research on gun violence prevention, right? To see if there was anything that I could use in my case that was either for universal background checks or against universal background checks, because I'm sure that an organization like the NRA, who I'd known previously because of my history in Boy Scouts and them like helping foster like things at shooting ranges, like at like summer camps, for example, I knew about them in that way, and like that, I thought initially that they were an organization that stood for gun owner protection and gun safety, like my father. So I'm looking up this research to be like, oh great, I'm gonna be able to say like, this doesn't protect gun owners, this like doesn't do all this, but I couldn't even find that because there was no research, because it's against the law to study gun violence research, and I found that out later. So I thought, wow, that's really weird. So the next thing I look up is like, I knew from some of my previous research that I had done that in over 50% of school shootings, the gun comes from a parent's household because it's the parent's gun. And I knew that, for example, because of previous debate cases that I had done, that if I broke into my parents' alcohol and got drunk off of it and went out and killed someone, that's a felony for my parents. What were the ramifications if somebody went and took their parents' gun and shot up a school, or went and took their parents' gun and killed someone? Oh, there are none, because of a law that the NRA pushed for. Because they only push for education, not actual laws that hold unsafe gun owners accountable, right? So after that, I thought to myself, what are the protections for gun safety, right? So I can at least argue that like, because I knew the NRA was going to be a big topic in a lot of these cases, like I can say like the NRA supports like putting guns under the Consumer Protection Act and making sure that guns just can't inadvertently go off. So I looked that up. Turns out they're not. I'm like, wow, this is really weird. It's almost like they don't want to protect gun owners, and they don't actually support gun owners, and they just want to sell more guns. So I looked up how they were funded, and it turned out that they were funded by mainly gun manufacturers that continuously benefit off of mass shootings, right? And I thought to myself, well, that's weird, because it's almost like the NRA is benefiting from mass shootings and the fear-mongering that they create from it. And it turns out they are, because gun sales go up after every mass shooting when they can go on NRA TV and say these gun-grabbing communists are coming to grab your guns, even if that's not the case at all, right? And it's like, oh, wow, this is a really bad organization. And that's how I found out about them before that. And then on top of that, like a year later, there was a Last Week Tonight episode by John Oliver that really informed me even more about it. So I think the best way to foster activism within your students is encourage them to be involved in the arts, be involved in speech and debate, and especially journalism. Student journalists are probably the best activists and the activists on every campus, whether or not they choose to realize it, because they realize the problems that are going on the campus, and there's oftentimes the only people advocating for it. So encouraging students to follow pathways in education in journalism and speech and debate to learn about the current problems that are going on in their schools and their communities is probably one of the best ways to foster activism.
David, we're very near the end here. If I may, I'm going to put you under a 30-second drill, maybe 45 seconds. What advice do you have for teachers in preventing gun violence in schools?
Honestly, trying to, first of all, have smaller class sizes is a bigger part of that, in my opinion. Like, the thing is, there haven't been many studies that have been done on school shootings specifically, like, other than the incredibly partisan, like, school safety report that refused to talk about guns that came out of the Trump administration about the shooting that happened at my school, which they recommended arming teachers, which is a horrible idea, because there's a reason school shootings there's a reason school shootings don't occur in other countries that don't have armed teachers, and it's not because they have more guns in those countries, it's because they have better laws that disarm domestic abusers, disarm people that are risk themselves and others. So what I would advocate for students to do and teachers to do is raise youth voter turnout, make sure you're turning out and getting your union to rally around common sense gun laws and child access prevention laws within your community, like the NEA or AFT, awesome unions, by the way. And yeah, talking to your principal about that in the first place, and violence intervention programs as well.
David, I think even people who don't agree with you have to admire your passion and dedication to what you're doing. And as you spoke here today and gave answers to these questions, it reminded me of a very old saying which has been captured in song, and that is that hearts can inspire other hearts with their fire. And you've been able to do that in an almost unique way since over this last year. And for that, whether we agree or disagree on individual things and your policy concerns, that we admire and appreciate. Want to go out where you're telling people, number one, if they want to get involved with the movement, where do they go?
Yeah, so if you guys want to get involved with March for Our Lives, you can start a chapter by going to marchforourlives.com or join your local chapter by going there. If you want to donate to March for Our Lives, same link, just marchforourlives.com. More importantly, if you want to register to vote, you can use that same website. And on top of that, I think the best way to get involved is by having conversations. And if you are, for example, somebody that doesn't agree with anything that I say, but you do believe in ending gun violence by supporting mental health care, and you don't agree that new gun laws will work, that's fine. Totally fine. Please go out there and call your congressman and tell them to fund actual mental health care within our schools and within our communities, because that is something that's needed, right? If you are someone that supports new gun laws and mental health funding, go out there and don't just get in a debate with like somebody that you don't agree with and say we just need to fund mental health care, we need new gun laws. Go out there and actually do something about it, because the second we debate each other and leave the table and not work together as Americans to solve gun violence is the second another child gets killed in a community in the United States. And it's time for that to end and for that not to be a partisan issue, because it can't be. The death of our future cannot be a partisan issue. And what I ask of each and every one of you, no matter your political party, no matter whether or not you agree with me, simply agree with the fact that this is an issue that needs to be addressed within Congress, within our state legislatures, and it needs to be something that's talked about and finally addressed, where young people, old people, people of every color and every demographic and every ethnicity go out there and turn out to vote, not just for political parties, but for morally just leaders that actually care about kids fucking dying. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Hogg. Well done.